Welcome back to the Health Longevity Secret Show with Dr. Robert Lufkin. Today, we take a look at how dangerous sugar really is for our children and ourselves, and why more people aren't aware of the risks. Then we will learn powerful strategies to help decrease our dependence on it. Dr. Michael Goran is the best-selling co-author of Sugarproof, The Hidden Dangers of Sugar That Are Putting Your Child's Health at Risk and What You Can Do. He is a professor of pediatrics at the Keck School of Medicine at the University of Southern California. Dr. Goran serves as co-director of the USC Diabetes and Obesity Research Institute. Dr. Goran received his PhD from the University of Manchester in 1986. Dr. Goran's research has focused on the causes and consequences of childhood obesity for over 30 years. In doing this, he has published over 350 professional peer-reviewed articles, wow, and reviews, and has raised over $50 million in funding for his work. Finally, before we begin, I would like to mention that this show is separate from my teaching and research roles at the medical school with which I am currently affiliated. It is, however, part of my continuing effort to bring quality, evidence-based information about health and longevity to the general public. Now, please enjoy this interview with Dr. Michael Goran. Dr. Michael Goran, welcome to our show.
Hi, welcome. Thank you so much, Robert, for having me on. Just looking forward to talking with you, and pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, first of all, I'm a big fan of the book that you and Emily wrote, Sugarproof. We'll put that in the show notes. There it is.
This book right here.
Excellent, excellent. We'll put that in the show notes, and a lot of the things that we're talking about today are covered in this book. So if people want to learn more, this is a great resource about it. So maybe before we dive into the material, maybe you could start off by just telling us how you came to be so interested in this area.
Yeah, sure. So this has been my passion. This has been my career for 35 years. So I've been doing research in childhood nutrition and health outcomes for over 30 years. And over the last, I'd say 10 to 15 years, a pretty clear message began to emerge from that research, and a pretty, I feel, compelling story. And I wanted to get that story out. I wanted to make it available to the broader public, because I think there's some very useful information there. And as you probably know, and probably your users know, there's always typically a 10, 15-year lag between research and practice, and I'm trying to accelerate that a little bit and get useful information out to the broader public. So it's just we'll talk about it, the story and the implications, but it's been my passion to do the research. We've learned so much, and I just wanted to get the message out.
That's great. Well, let's start off maybe on the basics to bring our audience up to speed. Maybe you could start off by telling us what exactly sugar is, and why is it so dangerous?
Yeah, so sugar has become so prolific in our food supply, and we're, as a population, adults and children are consuming more sugar, different types of sugar. Used to be most sugar was predominantly sucrose, table sugar, white crystalline sugar, which is sucrose, which is a disaccharide of glucose connected to fructose. But now there's over 200 different names and varieties of sugars. Those are just the caloric sugars, and there's the non-caloric sugars, the sweeteners. And consumption is prolific. Over 70% of processed manufactured foods have added sugars in there, and we're learning that excess sugars is causing a lot of health problems, not just for children, but for adults. But children are more susceptible for reasons we'll probably talk about. So sugar broad topic. We have a whole chapter just defining sugar, and it's over 200 different names that are currently used.
And how has our thinking changed about the harm that sugar causes? Because I remember growing up, sugar was considered to be, maybe it wasn't good for your teeth, but otherwise it, as long as you brush your teeth, you're fine, and you might gain weight with it. But now we're hearing about heart disease, dementia, stroke, even some cancers. What's changed?
Yeah, I think what's changed is we've learned a lot about how sugar affects metabolism beyond the caloric effect, beyond the direct effect on the teeth. So a lot about its metabolism, the byproducts of that metabolism, and how it affects the body. And for my own interest, how it affects the growing body, how it affects development. And because a lot of these things are slowly evolving, like heart disease, diabetes. And I think what's changed is what we've seen in the research in the last 10, 15, 20 years is the acceleration of some of those chronic diseases like heart disease, type 2 diabetes, the new emergence of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in adults and children, which can be related to diet and, from our research and others, to sugar in particular. So those are some of the issues that have changed. More sugar, different types of sugar, acceleration of these long-term chronic diseases, typically of adulthood, that we're seeing emerge in childhood, but we're not just worried about emergence, it's the slow development of these diseases that begins in childhood.
So even though these chronic diseases are in later life, children should still avoid sugar because of the fact that they begin very early. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's not like we're saying that sugar should be completely avoided and eliminated from the diet, because I think there's a place for it for sure, but I think it's become so prolific and so ubiquitous in the food supply, beyond just one or two special treats. I think there's the issue of hidden sugars added to foods that you don't even know are there, the emergence of, or the replacement of water and milk as the beverage of choice for kids with juice and soda and energy drinks. So I think we need to really reset some of these things that have become almost daily staples for kids, because the effect of the consumption adds up over time. So we need to kind of scale back and reset some of those things.
There have been various recommendations from different organizations about sort of maximum or recommended amounts of sugar. So I think the American Heart Association says 2 to 18 grams for children. I'm sorry, for age 2 to 18, the maximum number of grams is 25, and then for under age 2, it is 0. How do you feel about those numbers, and what are your recommendations?
Yeah, in the book we had recommend also 0 added sugar for infants age 0 to 2 years of age, and that's actually part of the newest dietary guidelines that were just released in January of this year. So that's something we've been talking about for a long time. So I'm happy to see that emerge. I mean, there's a huge disconnect between that recommendation and what's available in the food supply, because 80% of food products targeted for children, including infants, have added sugar. So we need to kind of balance what those recommendations are versus what is actually being produced and available to families everywhere. And then after 2 years of age, we align pretty closely. My recommendations would be pretty close to the American Heart Association and the new dietary guidelines, which say less than 10% of calories. And the World Health Organization would say even 5% of added calories. And for a child, that varies. I think the issue with the American Heart Association recommendations, which are good, but it's one number for kids and hard to compare a 2-year-old with an 18-year-old because their energy needs vary. So in the book, we have a chart that translates that relative to age because of the changes in energy requirements with age.
We always hear with macronutrients that there's a absolute minimum requirement of fats and proteins as the 2 macronutrients, but for carbohydrates, we often hear it said that there is no absolute minimum requirement for human life. Is that true?
Yeah, I don't know of any, and I think it's because ultimately carbohydrates are eventually break down to sugar themselves. So I've heard it said, I've heard people say, well, the body, it needs, there's an essential need for sugar. And that's true because every cell in the body uses glucose, which is a sugar, for energy and for survival. So absolutely the body needs sugar. So there is definitely a minimal need, but the body can make that a number of different ways. And again, that's not to say our stance is that we're not saying that sugar should be completely eliminated. I think that's completely unsustainable and unrealistic, especially for kids growing up today. But there should be a reduction, there should be a resetting or a maximum that we should be aiming for, not complete elimination.
So if we take that 25 gram a number as a recommendation, putting that in perspective, let's see, with a Coca-Cola, I think it's 30 some grams in one standard size Coke. So that would be half a Coke a day or something to reach the maximums. It's pretty easy to hit 25 grams, isn't it? With regular processed foods or things that people would likely encounter in a store.
Absolutely, and even a glass of apple juice, for example, which it has this healthy halo around it, but a glass of apple juice is quite similar in sugar content to a soda. And then there's hidden sugars in bread, yogurts, pasta sauces, those types of things where there's not really a need for sugar to be there, but that can add up. Breakfast cereal, most breakfasts for many families today would come pretty close, or if not exceed that 25 grams. So, in Sugarproof, we talk about ways to rebalance that out, to replace some of those added sugars, to make sure there's minimal added sugars at breakfast, and instead, replace that with fiber and protein, because it's also about mixing the macronutrients as well.
Yeah, no, that's very important.
But the bottom line is, you're right. There's a huge disconnect between what is now recommended for health by major organizations, including the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and what's actually available, what's being fed to kids in schools, for example, what is available by the food industry in the markets today. Huge disconnect.
Yes, I mean, when I was raised, orange juice was a healthy drink, and apple juice were healthy alternatives to other sweetened sugar drinks. But it sounds like what you're saying is, as far as the potential harm from sugar content, they're not a very healthy alternative.
Yeah, I mean, that's not to say you can, I'm not saying you can never have a glass of orange juice ever again, because fresh squeezed orange juice is delicious. But I think the issue is shouldn't be a daily staple. And commercial apple juice is incredibly sweet. So one simple solution to that is to dilute it down so you can still retain the flavor. And I think what's happening in the food supply today is things have become so sweet because the food industry knows that sweetness sells, but sweetness just overwhelms all the other taste receptors. So apple juice is, stop tasting like apples. It just tastes of sweetness. So I think we need to kind of rebalance that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good point. One thing I encounter in talking to people, even people in the healthcare system, if I raise the question about, sugar being harmful, their response is, well, how can it be harmful if it's sold in all the stores as sugar cereals? Look at all the children's sections of the grocery store are full of brightly colored boxes with heavily sweetened sugars. And if this were harmful, this wouldn't be available. Well, how can we respond to that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think again, there's a disconnect. I mean, the state of California has tried various times to put warning labels, for example, on soda, which would be the main contributing culprit. Warning labels about its health effects. Other countries around the world have addressed this with marketing or with front of label warnings or things like that. Obviously, that's going to be really difficult to change because it has such heavy weighted political issues, and trying to make those changes are difficult. And I think that's, for me, very difficult to achieve. So that's why I'm all about education and information and trying to inform people everywhere so that consumers can make the best choices for them and their families when making those decisions. So
Sure,
it's changing. It's changing slowly, but there's still no law against a food company making a cereal that delivers 10, 15 grams of added sugars per one bowl serving.
Yeah. In your role as co-director of the Diabetes and Obesity Center there, I wonder what your thoughts are on the increasing rates of diabetes and childhood diabetes and obesity. We're having what used to be called adult onset diabetes, type 2 diabetes, now occurring in children. And various explanations have been put forward for this. What do you feel are the explanations for these changes, and what role does sugar play in that?
Yeah, and I would add to that list fatty liver disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver, which wasn't even a disease 10 years ago, and is now very prevalent. I think it's an acceleration of the chronic disease aspect, like we talked about earlier, but also we shouldn't lose sight of the disparities here. So things like type 2 diabetes in childhood and fatty liver disease, huge disparity. We're seeing the highest levels there among Latino and Black African American populations and Native American populations, much higher levels. And I think there's a lot we don't know about why that predisposition is occurring and what makes those segments of the population more vulnerable. Is it an economic issue? Is it some kind of physiological difference? I mean, in Latinos, we know there's actually a genetic predisposition to fatty liver disease through a single nucleotide polymorphism. That's very specific, but it's still a factor. So I don't know. I think we're still a lot to learn about those disparities, because that's the real problem in terms of childhood disease emergence. So if you look at the numbers for type 2 diabetes in children or fatty liver disease in children, by far the numbers are highest in those groups. But what's happening generally across the board is an acceleration and an earlier onset. And I think it's because of early diet and even early environment related to nutrition, which is seeding these outcomes by altering physiology and metabolism.
Yeah. We just interviewed Tina Woods, who's a policy expert with the British healthcare system, and they're doing an analysis of liver disease and obesity and all, and she was saying how striking it was. You could predict the diseases that people have by the zip codes they're from, and and the socioeconomic conditions that they lived in. But yeah, this is a very important idea, and I wonder about the acceleration we're seeing. What does that reflect as far as changes in behavior of the people? I mean, there have been soda drinks and dietary things for the last 30 or 40 years, but what you're saying, there's an acceleration in these. What is changing that might be responsible for these increasing rates of fatty liver disease and obesity and type 2 diabetes that wasn't there 30 years ago?
Yeah, I think for children, like I mentioned earlier, there's been a shift. If you look at the data in, for example, beverage consumption, milk and water used to be the main beverage of choice. Not to say you and I never had a soda pop when we grew up, as I'm sure we did, but it's just that's the main source of beverage now. So there's liquid sugar. Is problematic that there's so many different sources of liquid sugar for children, and it's rapid. Its effect when it's consumed in liquid form, rapidly affecting metabolism, especially in the liver. So that's definitely one thing that has changed, and then just different types of sugar. So 30 years ago, the predominant type of sugar was sucrose, but now, in the 70s, we had the emergence of high fructose corn syrup, which most people know about and try to avoid. Well, not everybody, because it's still pretty ubiquitous in the food supply. But since then, over 200 different names, 200 different types of sugar. Nowadays, we have a lot of fruit-based sugars, which have this great healthy sounding halo around them, but fruit-based sugars are very high in fructose, and we've kind of shifted the balance in sugar source towards fructose, and fructose is more damaging, especially during growth and development. So I think those are some of the changes that are different to 40 or 50 years ago. More sugar, different types of sugar, and then sweeteners we can talk about as well, which have really also become prolific in the food supply and very varied.
Yeah, before we touch on sweeteners, one point about fructose. Why is it more damaging than glucose and the high fructose corn syrup also?
Yeah, so glucose and fructose, when they join together, that's sucrose, that's ordinary table sugar. Glucose and fructose are chemically identical. 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. But as soon as you consume them, they break apart, and their metabolic fates are very different. So glucose is the energy, like we mentioned, it's used for energy all over the body. All of the cells of your body are using glucose, and its uptake is very carefully regulated. Fructose, on the other hand, is not used directly for energy. In fact, 90% of fructose is cleared by the liver, and the liver's job, as you know, but just to say, the liver's job is to clear everything from the circulation that it doesn't want the body to get, like alcohol, toxins, drugs. And you can add to that list fructose, because it extracts fructose out of the circulation, and what we've learned is that it converts it to fat, and that fat can get stuck in the liver, and that's what causes fatty liver disease if it builds up to a high enough level. or that fructose converted to fat gets repackaged into lipids, fats, for circulation around the body. And that's where you get the link between sugar and cardiovascular disease. And then that metabolic pathway is very inflammatory, produces a lot of inflammatory molecules like uric acid, for example, and other pro-inflammatory molecules. So that when you invoke that pathway, it's inflammatory. So those are fundamental differences. Fructose is not directly used for energy. Now, that's not to say if you're thinking that you shouldn't be eating fruit because fruit contains fructose, because all this is very dose dependent and concentration dependent. So when you eat an apple, which has fructose in it, it's trickling into the body very slowly, and the body was designed to tolerate that. And under those conditions of low dose fructose trickling in with the fiber, the gut can actually convert some of that fructose into glucose, and that can be used for energy. But that's overwhelmed very easily when you drink a glass of apple juice. The body wasn't designed metabolically. It doesn't have the machinery to handle all that fructose all at once. So the only thing the body knows to do is to extract the fructose in the liver and convert it to fat. So there's a disconnect between our metabolic machinery and what we're feeding the metabolic machinery in today's food supply.
Yeah, I enjoyed reading from, I guess, Rob Lustig and others who've made the point that that before high fructose corn syrup was introduced, one of the leading causes of fatty liver disease was ethanol, and ethanol is handled to some extent very similarly to fructose by the liver and results in fatty liver. And once high fructose corn syrup was introduced widely in the population, now the leading cause of fatty liver disease is arguably the diet with the high fructose. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and as Rob Lustig says, fructose is alcohol without the buzz.
Yes.
Because the metabolic effects are the same, and it's not just high fructose corn syrup. You know, a lot of people now know that is problematic, but apple juice actually has more fructose than high fructose corn syrup. Apple juice is about 70% fructose. Soda made with high fructose corn syrup is 60% fructose. So fruit juice should really be called high fructose fruit juice, because we don't make that connection because it sounds good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So with the concern you've raised about high sugar consumption, how do you recommend, or what are some of the approaches? And I know basically half the book is devoted to this, so there's a lot of tools you give, but maybe you could share some of your approaches to helping children avoid or decrease the amount of sugar they consume. I know we talked earlier, we both have 2 daughters, so we directly face this in our lives.
Yeah, and what we talk about is not just, I mean, it was designed for children and families, but it's also relevant to adults too. And so, you know, if we look at the second part of the book, the first chapter is how to talk to kids about this issue, how to get them on board, how to motivate them to realize and understand the importance of this. And obviously that's very age dependent. A lot of what we talk about is age dependent and contextually different from family to family. So what works in your family with your kids might be very different from my family. So we understand there's different preferences and different contexts. So I think understanding that and making adjustments for that is, I think, very important. It's not prescriptive. I'm not a big fan of prescriptive solutions because everybody's situation is very different. So I think we have to kind of figure out what the situation is and what the culprits are. So that's one part of it. Breakfast is important because breakfast is important for kids. Becomes less so as they get older, but for young kids, breakfast is important, and the start to the day is typically a high sugary meal. So we have lots of tips and solutions for structuring breakfast meals. And that's not to say you have to like rip it up and start again. I think that a lot of the things we talk about are simple swaps and solutions and fixes, like what you put on your toast or what to add to pancake batter to shift the balance to make it healthier. That kind of stuff, hundreds of different tips and strategies. And then we have a 7-day plan and a 28-day plan. I said several times that we're not saying you should quit sugar forever, but the 7-day plan says, okay, what would it look like if you quit sugar for 7 days? And those 7 days are meant to serve several functions. One is just so you understand and realize where the sources of sugar are every day, hidden and otherwise. So whether that's in peanut butter or pasta sauce, so it walks you through planning for that and just eliminating all sources of added sugars for 1 week, and step-by-step planning for how to do that and get through it, because it's a way to reset. It's like a Control-Alt-Delete. We're so wired up for sugar and sweetness. And this is a way to kind of reboot the system. And what we found when working with families is the first day or two are tough because everybody wants their peanut butter or their jam on their toast and their apple juice or whatever. But after a day or two, kids are resilient and they get through it. And what parents report is they see their kids off of sugar, and it's almost like a new kid in some cases, and a resolution of a lot of issues and concerns. And, that's not to say that that's like a magic fix, but it certainly resets the system, and you end up making adjustments afterwards, and you may shift back to, you may kind of coast back to where you were, and then in 3 months or 6 months, you might have to do it again. But that's one solution. And we have recipes. I mean, again, all of our recipes say, how can you bake an everyday treat for a kid and not have added sugar? And again, that's not to say I don't have added sugar in my pantry. So we do use sugar in baking, but we challenged ourselves to say, how can you make a cookie? How can you make a cake? How can you make a blueberry muffin, an energy bar without added sugar? So we came up with very creative ways. We just released a recipe, for example, on our website for Nutella. Everybody loves Nutella, but we wanted to say, well, can you make a Nutella without added sugar? Again, not to say you can never have Nutella again, but there's alternatives. And so we're trying to be creative in coming up with healthier alternatives. And kids actually like it, and maybe they'll get involved with some of that process too, because getting kids involved in the kitchen is an important aspect of this too.
Yes, I enjoyed the Nutella recipe. I noticed it on your website. It looks great, and that's a great approach to engage people in a short term, even like you say, a 7-day plan to decrease the amount of sugar and then lower your body's set points for sugar, so you don't crave it so much and just see the difference. That's fascinating. What about sugar substitutes as an alternative? There are many different on the market. What are the good choices? Which ones should we avoid?
I think avoid all of them. I don't think there's a good one right now. I would not lean on them as an alternative. I think that's a mistake. I think the food industry is doing that. The food industry gets rewarded by they've been mandated to reduce sugar, so all they're doing is reducing sugar and replacing it with sweeteners, then we don't even know what they're doing in the body. They've passed toxicity tests. They've become generally recognized as safe, but there's no long-term studies on their effects, especially on growing kids, number one. Number two, they don't solve the craving for sweetness that we're trying to address. And number three, they kind of trick the body. I mean, they're designed to deliver sweetness without the calories, which is what they do. But there's these receptors for sweetness are still turned on. And when the sweet taste receptor gets turned on, the body thinks there's sugar coming in. So what's the body going to do if it knows sugar's coming in? Is it's going to take sugar out of the blood. Blood glucose is going to fall because the body thinks there's an excess, but there's not. So then what happens when blood glucose falls? You get cranky and hungry and start seeking out more food. So in fact, studies show that habitual consumption of sweeteners is related to more calorie consumption, not less. At the point of consumption, that one cookie, yes, it has less calories, but you might end up eating 3 of those cookies instead of 1 or 2. And then you might, because your body's still craving sugar, eat more later in the day. And then the fourth thing is, because calories are not absorbed, where do they go? They're fermenting in the gut. So basically the gut bacteria end up metabolizing these sweeteners, so it affects the gut microbiome and gut health. And then number 5, I just don't think they taste very good. So if I'm going to make cookies or a cake, I'm not going to replace sugar with stevia or monk fruit, because then it's not going to taste very good. I think the much smarter solution is just to use less sugar. So if the recipe calls for a cup of sugar, you could add half a cup or even 30% less, and I'll guarantee you those cookies will taste just as good, if not better. It's not going to affect the texture, and probably the taste will be just as good, if not better. So I think the much smarter solution is just to use less sugar, not replace it with some sweetener. We don't know how it's affecting the body, and it may cause you to eat more.
Yeah, so a lot of the harm from sugar is not only from the sugar itself, but from the downstream metabolic effects that sugar cause with insulin and other factors. And what you're saying is a lot of these artificial sweeteners, although they're not sugar themselves, they can trigger some of the metabolic effects downstream that sugar would with insulin and other things, aside from, and also the unknown risk of their, we've seen that they're not toxic, but their long-term safety effects and their effects on the gut.
They may, absolutely. They've passed toxicity tests. That doesn't mean to say they're not causing other effects in the body. So yeah, it's all about the downstream metabolism. I think we tend to forget about that when we're eating something.
Thinking just about your work in obesity and diabetes and all, Gary Taubes has famously made the argument that calories in don't equal calories out and all that. What's your thinking on, is it calories in equals calories out anymore, or is that changing?
It's changing, and I think the glucose versus fructose comparison is a perfect example of why it's not just about the calories. So glucose and fructose both yield 4 calories per gram. That's the caloric equivalent. Both molecules are chemically identical. They have a different shape. One's a hexagon, one's a pentagon. That turns out to be pretty important. And once consumed metabolically, they're just very different. So it's all about how these identical chemicals are metabolized very differently, and what they trigger. as you say, downstream turns out to be very important. So there's a perfect example of a calorie of glucose versus a calorie of fructose having very, very different effects on the body.
Yeah, and one other thing people we're hearing a lot about is macronutrient sequencing in diets, that it's not just what you eat, but it's the order that you eat them, so that a sugary drink followed by fat and protein is more potentially harmful metabolically than a meal with fat and protein at front and then the sugar at the end, for the way it's handled in the gut and other factors. Do you agree with that also?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I've personally tested it. So I think these things are probably going to be pretty uniquely personal as well. And we're not, we're still starting to get a handle on that, but for sure, combination is important as well as sequencing. So for example, some of our recipes will use dates as a sweetener in our energy bars, and people say, well, why are you using dates? It has such a glycemic index. And that's true. If you were to eat like, a handful of dates, it will shoot your glucose way up. But if you're just putting dates into a mixture with fiber and protein and other macronutrients, the combination will not spike your sugar as much. And I've done those comparisons because I've worn a glucose monitor several times and kind of monitored, like if I have a piece of toast, plain toast, that will increase my blood sugar. But if I put eggs on it or some other source of protein or fiber, it can dampen that glucose spike. So I think ultimately it's all about finding out what kind of helps keep your blood glucose levels as stable as possible during the day.
Yeah. Well, maybe in the last few moments we could talk about knowing what you know as an expert in this field. How has this knowledge influenced the personal choices that you make in your life about diet or even exercise and lifestyle?
Yeah, I've been reflecting on this a lot recently, actually. So, I mean, what I've came to the conclusion was, so for me, I track a lot of stuff over time. So I have a digital scale that connects to an app, so I can look at my weight records over the last 10 years. And I think, at our age, I think it's important to kind of monitor those month to month and year to year changes, because things kind of creep up on you. So it's important to spot those early. I don't follow a set prescriptive diet because I like the flexibility. I love cooking. I love eating. I love to kind of eat in season, and I have a family, so we like to decide together what to eat. So, we tend to follow more of a guideline approach, which I like because it's more flexible and not so prescriptive. So some of our guide, I mean, I eat minimal processed foods, lots of fruits and vegetables. We do a lot of home cooking, local shopping, and that kind of stuff. So we just, I believe more in kind of getting good quality ingredients. I don't drink alcohol. I haven't for the last 10 years because I realized I didn't like the way it made me feel. And I've never really liked coffee. So I drink a lot of green tea. That's kind of my beverage of choice. I like the taste, and that's what I like. Exercise wise, about 10 years ago, I rediscovered my childhood love of tennis, and I love to play tennis. So I don't get to play enough, but once or twice a week, that's kind of my go-to. And again, I don't have a set routine. I'd like to walk and run once in a while, but I like the flexibility more than anything. So I don't like to kind of be bogged down, although planning helps. So it helps me to know what days work well for me. So those are some of the things I use. So to just, being flexible, not being bogged down by a prescription. Oh, and the other thing I started to do personally was I do intermittent fasting maybe 4 or 5 days a week now. where I'll basically just combine breakfast and lunch into one meal, like around 11 or 12. So I usually fast between dinner and late morning or lunchtime. So that I believe in. I think the research on that's pretty strong. And it works for me because I feel more energetic during the day. And also, having worn a glucose monitor several times, I know that it's very helpful to stabilize my blood glucose. I'm actually right on the verge. Surprisingly, my HbA1c is like 5.7, which is at the lowest point of diagnosis of prediabetes, right? So that concerned me. That was about 4 or 5 years ago. Although my blood glucose fluctuates in the 90s, when I wore the glucose monitor, my glucose was within normal range, like 98% of the time. Mm. And my HbA1c has stayed at 5.7. So I feel pretty good about that. I think
have you checked your fasting insulin?
I think that no. I think that should be a standard clinical test, shouldn't it?
Yeah. I mean, one thing that people are discovering now is that rising glucose and HA1C are relatively late findings in diabetes. It's at the point where our pancreas is beginning to fail, and that insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia, elevation of the insulin, can precede clinical diagnosis of type 2 diabetes by 10 years or so, and that tracking elevation in insulin can help people begin to see the course they're on. So we recommend, a lot of people are finding value in checking their fasting insulin levels, although, as you say, it's still a weird test that most physicians don't order for their patients unless they specifically request it, but hopefully that's changing.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I've never actually looked at my fasting insulin. I mean, from a research perspective, it's like top of our list. Like, it's like if people ask me if they're doing a study, what should I measure? I'll say fasting insulin, but clinically that's not how we're thinking. So I think that needs to change. I think part of the problem there is that the assay is so difficult, isn't it? I mean, and so variable. So it would help if we had a better standard, even just a standard lab assay, let alone a fast measure that we could do at home, which would be even better. So that's definitely missing.
Yeah, that's really a good point. What's the best way for people to follow you and find out about your work in addition to your book? What is the website they should go to?
Yeah, the website is sugarproofkids.com. And then on social media, Instagram and Facebook, it's at sugarproofkids. So through those portals, you can follow us, you can email me directly through any of those, and I'll get those emails. I'm happy to hear from you.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Michael. I guess we can cross off Coca-Cola as being a sponsor for this program, but that's they were never really in the running anyway. But
yes,
thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today and share your knowledge about this very important topic.
Thanks, Robert. Thank you for talking about it and for getting people more informed about some of these issues. So thank you so much for what you're doing.
Note, this is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking of it because of something you have seen here. If you find this to be of value of you, please hit that like button and subscribe to support the work we do on this channel. Also, we take your suggestions and advice very seriously. Please let us know what you'd like to see on this channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll hope to see you next time.